Decades had passed, but the guilt still gnawed at Amos Grey. In his twilight years, the old man shuffled toward the remote cliffside where his closest friend, Henry, had fallen to his death 50 years prior. Haunted by unanswered questions and whispers of the supernatural, Amos sought to summon Henry's spirit, desperate for the truth. As night fell and the winds howled, an eerie voice responded. What Amos heard would unravel the past, shake his reality, and leave him forever haunted. The wind carried a biting chill as Amos Grey stared out at the barren farmland that had been his world for decades. The skeletal branches of oak trees clawed at the gray sky, and the first hints of winter settled over the land. But tonight, something gnawed at him, a call from the past he had tried to forget. 50 years ago, on a stormy night, his best friend, Henry Lawson, had died at Black Hollow Cliff. Amos had been there, but the memory refused to sit still. It haunted him, like a shadow that didn't belong. For 50 years he had buried himself in the routines of life, marriage, children, and the endless work of the farm. But the weight of that night never lifted. Henry's scream, the crash of waves, and the chilling silence that followed had stayed with him. The memory came in fragments, and no matter how hard Amos tried, he couldn't piece together the truth. The world had called it an accident, but Amos knew it was more than that. Now, at 74, with time running short, he couldn't ignore the ghosts of his past any longer. Then the letter came. Its envelope was brittle, the handwriting shaky but deliberate. It read, "Amos, it's time. Come to Black Hollow Cliff. The truth awaits you." There was no signature, no clue as to who had sent it. At first, Amos dismissed it as a cruel prank, but the words burrowed into his thoughts. What truth? Had someone seen what happened? Or was it Henry, calling out from the grave? Amos had never believed in ghosts, but he knew the weight of unfinished business. With trembling hands, he packed a small bag, told his wife he needed a few days away, and set off toward the cliff. The journey was long and grueling. His old truck groaned as it climbed winding roads through darkened forests. The trees seemed taller here, their twisted branches forming shapes that reminded him of grasping hands. The air grew colder, heavier, as though the land itself knew the significance of his return. When he arrived, Black Hollow Cliff was just as he remembered, towering and jagged, with waves smashing against the rocks below. The gray sky swirled with restless clouds, and the wind howled like a living thing. Amos stepped out of his truck, his knees aching, and made his way to the edge. Every step felt like it carried the weight of the years. Memories surfaced unbidden. Henry's laughter, the argument, and the moment everything shattered. He stopped at the precipice, staring into the abyss. "Henry," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I'm sorry." His words were carried off by the wind, and for a moment there was only silence. Then a sharp gust nearly knocked him off his feet. He steadied himself, his heart pounding. Was it just the wind, or was something else listening, watching? Amos shivered, clutching his coat tighter, and moved toward the spot where Henry had fallen. The pull of the past was stronger now, undeniable. Whatever truth waited for him at Black Hollow, Amos knew it would not come without a cost. Amos Grey had thought leaving home would be the hardest part, but the journey itself proved more harrowing. The empty highway stretched endlessly ahead, and each mile brought him closer to Black Hollow Cliff, where his past lingered like an unspoken accusation. His battered truck groaned beneath him, the engine coughing as it climbed narrow, winding roads. The land grew darker as he traveled. Tall, twisted trees lined the roads, their branches forming canopies that blocked the light. Shadows flickered in his periphery, but when he turned his head, there was nothing. The silence pressed on him like a weight, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the static from the truck's ancient radio. Memories crept in as he drove. Henry's face, lit by the excitement of youth, urging Amos to climb higher, to take risks. Henry had always been braver. That night, 50 years ago, Henry had insisted they explore the cliffs despite the storm. Amos had hesitated but followed as he always did. Then came the argument. Sharp words spoken in anger, Henry's sudden scream, and the darkness that swallowed him whole. The truck jolted over a pothole, snapping Amos from his thoughts. He tightened his grip on the wheel, sweat slicking his palms. The guilt he had carried for decades weighed heavily, but the thought of what might await him at the cliff filled him with an unfamiliar dread. He wasn't sure if he wanted answers anymore. Fog thickened as he neared Black Hollow, wrapping around the truck like a shroud. The headlights pierced it only faintly, casting ghostly beams. The air grew colder, sharper, and the road narrowed, forcing Amos to slow. When he finally reached the end of the path, the cliffs loomed ahead, stark and unyielding against the gray sky. Stepping out of the truck, Amos felt the wind bite at his skin. The air was charged, carrying an unnatural weight. He moved toward the cliffs, his knees trembling with age and unease. The overgrown path to the edge snagged at his coat, but he pushed through, drawn by a pull he couldn't explain. The roar of the waves below echoed memories he'd long tried to suppress. At the edge, he stared down at the jagged rocks and whispered, "Henry, I'm here." His voice was lost to the wind, but silence followed, a stillness that prickled at his nerves. He didn't expect a response, but when a faint voice whispered his name, he froze. "Amos," it said. The word hung in the air, carried by the wind. His heart pounded as he turned, searching the shadows, but found nothing. Yet he knew he hadn't imagined it. The voice had been real. It was Henry. The weight of the moment drove Amos to his knees. He had come seeking the truth, but now he wasn't sure he wanted it. Whatever answers lay ahead, they would change everything, and he feared they would destroy him. The voice echoed in Amos's mind long after it faded. Amos. It was faint, barely carried on the wind, but unmistakably Henry's. The sound struck him to his core, his legs unsteady as he stumbled back from the cliff's edge. For a moment he wondered if he'd imagined it. The silence that followed pressed heavily on him, suffocating and absolute. Amos retreated to his truck, his breath uneven. From his bag, he pulled out an old leather-bound book he had discovered years ago among Henry's belongings. Its brittle pages had long tempted him, though he had never dared to open it. Tonight, he felt he had no choice. The book's contents were strange. Rituals, symbols, and instructions for summoning the spirits of the dead. One passage stood out. "The veil is thin at the edge of the world. Call carefully, for what answers may not be what you seek." Amos's fingers hovered over the page, his heart heavy with indecision. Scribbled in the margins was an ominous warning. "Do not call without courage. The dead remember." And yet, Amos had come to Black Hollow Cliff for this moment. He needed to know the truth. Memories surged forward. Their laughter, the argument, the scream that still haunted him. The book trembled in his hands as he carried it back to the edge of the cliff. The ritual was deceptively simple. Speak the words to pierce the veil. Amos hesitated as he stared into the abyss. Did he truly want to call Henry back? Would the answers bring peace, or something worse? With a deep breath, Amos began. The words felt foreign, their rhythm unnatural. Each syllable seemed to echo as though the cliffs themselves amplified his voice. The wind died, replaced by an eerie stillness. The world felt wrong, as though it held its breath. Then the ground trembled. Amos staggered, the book slipping from his hands. The air grew thick, and the shadows around him rippled as though alive. From somewhere in the darkness came a voice. "Why did you let me fall?" The words hit Amos like a blow, cutting through years of guilt. His breath caught as he turned wildly, his eyes scanning the void. But there was nothing, only the faint outline of the cliffs and swirling darkness. The voice came again, closer now. "Amos." He sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. This was why he had come. To hear Henry again. To understand. But now, with the veil breached, Amos feared he had made a terrible mistake. The voice faded, leaving Amos alone in the cold embrace of the cliffs. The silence wasn't empty. It was alive, charged with a presence Amos could feel but not see. Whatever he had called forth, it wasn't just Henry. The shadows seemed to pulse, watching, waiting, as if the cliff itself had become a gateway. Amos sat trembling, the book lying forgotten at his side. The ritual had worked, but at what cost? He had crossed a line he couldn't uncross, and he knew, deep down, that Black Hollow would not release him without its answers, or its price. The night stretched on as Amos sat frozen at the edge of Black Hollow Cliff, the chilling wind clawing at his coat. Henry's voice still echoed in his mind. "Why did you let me fall?" The words gnawed at him, dragging him back to fragmented memories he had spent decades avoiding. Had he truly let Henry fall? The uncertainty clawed at him. The weight of the ritual pressed on him like a suffocating fog. He had spoken the words, breached the barrier between the living and the dead, but what had answered wasn't the closure he'd longed for. Whatever he had summoned felt darker, more vengeful than the Henry he had known. The night air grew unnaturally heavy. Amos clutched his coat, his hands trembling. The book lay beside him, its pages still fluttering as if alive. He couldn't touch it again. Not yet. His gaze drifted to the jagged rocks below, the faint moonlight barely illuminating their cruel edges. Then he heard it. A whisper. It was faint, softer than before, as though it rose directly from the depths of the cliff. Amos turned his head sharply, his pulse quickening. "Amos." The voice sounded pleading this time, almost childlike. It was no longer the accusatory tone he had first heard. "Henry?" Amos called, his voice shaking. The whisper repeated his name, growing louder, compelling him forward. The cold deepened with each hesitant step toward the edge, the ground beneath his feet shifting as though warning him to stop. Peering over the edge, Amos's breath caught. A faint, translucent figure stood among the jagged rocks far below. It was unmistakably Henry. His face turned upward, staring directly at Amos. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the faint, mournful voice. "Amos, why did you leave me?" Tears blurred Amos's vision. "I didn't leave you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't." The figure's head tilted slightly, its gaze piercing. Then it began to move, ascending the jagged rocks with unnatural speed. Amos staggered backward, his heart pounding. The whispers became a roar, filled with rage. "You left me! You let me fall!" Amos dropped to his knees, clutching his head as the words thundered in his ears. The ground beneath him trembled violently, cracks forming along the cliffside as though the earth itself reacted to the spirit's anger. "I didn't mean to," Amos cried out. "I tried to save you." The voice stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Amos opened his eyes to find the figure gone. The wind had stilled, but the cliff was forever changed. Fresh cracks marred the ground, and the air felt heavier than before, as though the very space around him had been scarred. Shaking, Amos sat back, his chest heaving. He had come here seeking the truth, but all he had found was terror. The figure, the voice. Was it truly Henry? Or had something darker answered his call, something that fed on his guilt and regret? His gaze drifted to the book, lying on the ground as though waiting for him to pick it up again. One chilling thought surfaced. The ritual wasn't over. Whatever he had summoned was far from finished. Amos sat at the edge of Black Hollow Cliff, the whispers still echoing in his mind. "Why did you let me fall?" Henry's voice haunted him, dragging him back to memories he had buried for decades. The ritual had worked, but it hadn't brought peace. Instead, it had awakened shadows. Shadows of his past and something darker, more malicious. The air was heavy, pressing against his chest as he stared at the jagged rocks below. The book lay beside him, its worn pages fluttering in the cold wind. Amos couldn't bring himself to touch it again, not yet. His mind swirled with fragments of that night, the storm, the argument, and the fall. But the details were maddeningly incomplete, like a puzzle missing its most crucial piece. 50 years ago, Henry had pushed too far, as he always did. The storm had been fierce, the rain blinding, but Henry had insisted they climb the cliff anyway. Amos could remember the way the wind howled, the way Henry's voice rose above it, filled with anger and defiance. Then, the fall, the scream, the silence. Amos closed his eyes, his fists clenched as he tried to piece together the fragments. He hadn't let Henry fall. He couldn't have. But the voice said otherwise. "You remember, don't you?" it had whispered, a question that felt more like an accusation. Amos shook his head, trying to push the thought away, but it lingered, growing louder with each passing moment. The moonlight cast strange shadows across the cliffside, the cracks in the ground forming patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Amos felt as though the cliff itself was alive, watching him, waiting. The night was silent, but the stillness was suffocating, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. Then, faintly, the whisper returned. "Amos." His breath caught as he turned toward the sound. There was no figure this time, no ghostly form climbing the rocks, but the presence was unmistakable. The air grew colder, sharper, and Amos felt the weight of unseen eyes on him. "Amos," the voice said again, louder now. "You remember. You've always known." Amos's hands trembled as he picked up the book, its leather cover cool against his skin. "I don't know what you're talking about," he whispered, though the words felt like a lie. Deep down, he could feel the truth stirring, clawing its way to the surface. He wasn't ready to face it, not yet. The voice paused as if waiting before adding, "Come closer." The command chilled him to the bone, but his body betrayed him, inching forward toward the cliff's edge. Amos felt the pull of the abyss, its black depths beckoning him with a terrifying allure. Every step was a battle against instinct, a war between fear and the desperate need for answers. As he peered down, nothing stared back but the empty rocks below. Yet the voice returned, whispering again, "You let me fall, Amos. Now you'll see." The wind howled, its force nearly knocking Amos backward. He clutched the book tightly, retreating just as the ground beneath him trembled once more. The cracks along the cliff widened and the shadows around him pulsed, alive and watchful. The ritual wasn't over, and Amos knew the truth was closer than ever, but it would come at a cost he wasn't prepared to pay. The pale light of dawn spilled over Black Hollow Cliff, illuminating the cracks in the earth that seemed deeper now, more menacing. Amos sat motionless on the cold ground, the weight of the previous night pressing on him like a stone. Henry's voice still echoed in his mind. "You let me fall." Amos clutched the leather-bound book tightly, his hands trembling. The cliff was silent now, but Amos felt the presence lingering. The ritual had worked, but it had brought neither peace nor answers, only more questions. His memories of that night 50 years ago remained hazy, the storm, the argument, and Henry's fall. But the voice had stirred something within him, fragments of a truth he wasn't ready to face. Amos opened the book again, scanning its brittle pages. A line caught his eye. "The truth binds the living and the dead. Speak, and they will remember." The words seemed to taunt him, feeding the guilt that had haunted him for decades. What had really happened that night? The pieces didn't fit, yet the voice's accusations refused to leave him. The air grew heavier, charged with an unseen energy, and then the voice returned. "You remember," it said, louder this time. "You've always remembered." Amos froze, the book slipping from his hands. His breath hitched as he whispered, "I don't know what you mean." But even as he spoke, he felt the lie in his words. The memories began to surface, unbidden and sharp. Henry's face twisted with anger as the storm raged around them, their voices raised in a heated argument. Henry stepping too close to the edge. Amos reaching out, not to save him, but to push him back. Or had it been a push? "You pushed me," the voice accused, its tone bitter and unrelenting. "No," Amos whispered, shaking his head. "It wasn't like that. I didn't mean to—" "You let it happen," the voice interrupted, rising to a roar. "You let me fall." The words struck Amos like a physical blow, forcing him to his knees. The fragmented memories came together with brutal clarity. His hands on Henry's chest, the moment of rage, the push. He had told himself it was an accident, that he had been trying to save Henry. But now, faced with the truth, Amos couldn't deny it. His anger, his frustration, they had been the catalyst. "I'm sorry," Amos sobbed, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The wind howled around him, and then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The air was still, but Amos felt the weight of the presence lingering, watching. The cliff felt alive, its cracks deepening as if to swallow him whole. Slowly, Amos lifted his head. The truth had been revealed, but it brought no solace. The guilt he had carried for 50 years was now an unbearable force, pressing against his chest. The shadows around him stretched unnaturally, pulsing with something dark and malevolent. Amos picked up the book, his fingers brushing over the worn leather. The ritual wasn't over. He could feel it in the air, in the earth beneath him. Whatever he had summoned wasn't finished, and Amos wasn't sure if he had the strength to face what came next. Amos sat motionless at the edge of Black Hollow Cliff, the leather-bound book heavy in his hands. The sunlight did little to dispel the shadows that lingered in the cracks of the earth. Henry's voice echoed in his mind, accusing, unrelenting. Amos had opened a door he couldn't close, and now the past demanded its due. The silence was suffocating. Amos felt the presence lingering just beyond his sight. The voice returned, soft at first, carried on the wind. "Amos!" He flinched, clutching the book tighter. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You know what I want," the voice replied. "You owe me." Amos's chest tightened. The guilt he had carried for 50 years now weighed heavier than ever. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "I never meant for you to fall." The voice laughed, bitter and hollow. "Meaning doesn't matter. You let it happen. You have to make it right." The ground beneath Amos seemed to shift, the cracks widening. "How?" he asked desperately. "What do I have to do?" The wind howled and the voice grew colder. "A life for a life." Amos's breath caught. The weight of the words crushed him. "What do you mean?" he whispered, though he already knew. "You took my life," the voice said, sharp and unrelenting. "Now you must give yours. Only then will the truth be balanced." "No," Amos said, shaking his head. "There has to be another way. Tell me what to do. Anything but that." The voice roared with fury. "There is no other way. The debt must be paid." Amos fell to his knees, clutching the book as tears streamed down his face. Desperation took hold, and a thought surfaced. What if he could bargain? "What if I stay?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I'll stay here, at the cliff. I won't leave. I'll be yours, your keeper, your servant. Just let me live." The wind stilled. For a moment, Amos thought he had been heard, that his plea might be enough. But the voice returned, colder and final. "You don't decide. The debt must be paid." The shadows around him seemed to move, wrapping closer, pulling at him. Amos felt trapped, the weight of the presence pressing down on him. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a sentence. The book slipped from his hands, landing on the cracked earth. Amos stared at it, tears blurring his vision. He had sought answers, and now he had them. But the truth had come at a cost he couldn't bear. "You don't have to fight," the voice said, softer now, almost pitying. "The cliff will take you. It's only a matter of time." Amos sat in silence, his mind racing. He thought of his family, of the life he had tried to build after Henry's death. He had always believed that time could heal the wounds of the past, but now he understood. Time hadn't healed anything. It had only sharpened the edges of his guilt, turning it into something inescapable. The wind picked up again, carrying the voice's final words. "You took everything from me, Amos. Now it's your turn." As the shadows crept closer, Amos felt the weight of the cliff beneath him, alive and shifting. He realized, with a sinking dread, that Black Hollow would not let him go. Not until the debt was paid in full. The sky over Black Hollow Cliff darkened, casting shifting shadows across the cracked earth. Amos sat hunched near the edge, weighed down by the voice that echoed in his mind. "You let me fall. Now it's your turn." His guilt pressed down on him, a suffocating force that made it hard to breathe. The whispers around him grew louder, a chorus of accusations rising from the very ground beneath him. They weren't just Henry's voice anymore. They were many. Each whisper was a reminder of the guilt Amos had carried for 50 years, guilt that now seemed to take on a life of its own. Every crack in the earth felt alive, speaking truths Amos had tried to bury. He clutched his head, his body trembling as the memories surged. He hadn't meant to push Henry. He told himself that over and over. But now, with the ritual forcing the truth to the surface, Amos couldn't deny what had happened. It wasn't deliberate, but it wasn't an accident either. His frustration, his anger, it had been enough to send Henry over the edge. The book lay at Amos's feet, its leather cover gleaming as though it pulsed with life. The ritual wasn't over, and Amos knew it. The voice had demanded payment, and the debt was clear. "A life for a life," it had said. But now, the whispers carried a different message. "You think this is about guilt?" a voice hissed, louder than the rest. It wasn't Henry's anymore. It was something darker, angrier. "You think guilt is enough to settle the balance? Fool." Amos blinked, his mind reeling. I didn't mean to," he stammered. The air around him thickened, the shadows pulsing as though they fed on his fear. "You took his life," the voice continued, "but you stole more than that. His dreams, his future, his legacy. And you think guilt is enough?" Tears streamed down Amos's face as the weight of the words bore down on him. "I didn't mean to," he whispered again, his voice hollow. The voice snapped back. "This is not just about what you did, it's about what you destroyed." Amos felt his breath hitch as the enormity of the voice's accusation settled over him. The ripples of that night stretched far beyond Henry's death. Henry's family, his friends, his future, all of it had been erased because of Amos's moment of anger. The thought overwhelmed him, leaving him gasping for air as the shadows closed in. The wind roared around him, and Amos's gaze fell to the book. Its pages shifted, forming new words that hadn't been there before. One passage seemed to glow with dark ink. "To restore balance, one must offer what remains. Sacrifice is the only payment." "Sacrifice," Amos whispered, his chest tightening. He thought of his family, the life he had tried to rebuild after Henry's death. Could he give all of that up? Could he truly offer himself to the abyss? The wind stilled, and the voice softened, though its edge remained. "You know what must be done, Amos. The question is, do you have the strength to do it?" Amos sat in silence, the shadows looming over him. The truth was clear, but the path ahead was darker than anything he had ever faced. Amos stood at the edge of Black Hollow Cliff, the shadows around him alive and pulsing. The book in his hands felt heavier than ever, its pages fluttering in the wind. The voice had grown silent, but its final words echoed in his mind. You know what must be done. He stared down at the jagged rocks below, the memory of Henry's fall flashing before his eyes. The anger, the storm, the moment his hands had reached out, not to save, but to push. Amos had convinced himself it was an accident, but now, faced with the truth, he couldn't deny it. His anger had been the catalyst. Henry's death was his fault. The wind howled, carrying a faint whisper. Amos. His chest tightened as he closed his eyes. I'm here, he said softly, his voice trembling. You've always known, the voice replied. You've always known what you must do. Amos opened his eyes, his heart pounding. The abyss stretched before him, dark and endless. The shadows pulsed, drawing closer, urging him forward. The book grew heavier in his hands, as though it too demanded action. He thought of his family, his wife, his children. Would they understand? Would they forgive him? I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. The ground beneath him trembled, the cracks widening as though the earth itself was pulling him toward the edge. Amos took a deep, shuddering breath and stepped closer. Is this what you want? He called out. Will this make it right? The wind stilled and the voice answered, soft but certain. The balance must be restored. Tears streamed down Amos's face as he inched closer to the precipice. The abyss loomed before him, waiting. For a moment he hesitated, his heart clinging to the life he had tried to rebuild. But the weight of the past was too much. He had carried it for 50 years, and now it demanded release. The shadows surged, enveloping him in darkness. Amos closed his eyes, his body trembling. He took one final step, the edge of the cliff crumbling beneath his feet. The wind roared in his ears as he fell. But then he stopped. Amos opened his eyes, gasping. He was lying on the ground at the cliff's edge, the book beside him. Its pages were blank, its power gone. The voice was silent, the shadows receding into the earth. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight that had hung over him now lifted. The balance had been restored, but not in the way Amos had expected. By offering himself, by facing the truth and accepting his guilt, he had paid the debt. The cliff had released him, sparing his life but leaving its mark. Amos stood, his legs unsteady, and looked out over the horizon. The morning light broke through the clouds, bathing the cliff in a golden glow. For the first time in 50 years, Amos felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Peace. The ritual was over, but its lessons would remain forever. Amos stood at the edge of Black Hollow Cliff, the morning sun spilling over the jagged rocks below. The shadows that had haunted him were gone, and the air felt lighter, though the weight in his chest lingered. The book lay at his feet, its pages blank, its power extinguished. The ritual was over, but Amos knew the cost had been steep. He knelt to pick up the book, the leather cold against his fingers. Its presence no longer felt oppressive, but the silence it left behind was unsettling. Amos ran his thumb over the worn cover, his mind replaying the events of the night. He had faced the truth, offered himself to the abyss, and somehow he had been spared. But why? The wind carried a faint whisper, not of accusation, but of release. The debt is paid. The words echoed in his mind, and Amos felt the faintest sense of peace begin to take root. The guilt that had consumed him for decades hadn't vanished, but it had lessened, as if Henry, or whatever force had answered, had finally let go. Amos turned toward the horizon, the rising sun painting the cliffs in shades of gold and red. For the first time in 50 years, he allowed himself to feel the beauty of the world. He thought of his wife, his children, his grandchildren. They had been his reason to keep going, but they had never known the full weight he carried. Could he tell them now? Would they understand? As he turned to leave, something caught his eye in the dirt. a faint glint of metal where the book had fallen. Amos bent down and uncovered a pocket watch, tarnished but intact. He recognized it instantly. Henry's watch. He hadn't seen it since the night Henry fell. Amos's breath hitched as he held the watch in his hands, its surface etched with Henry's initials. He opened it, the cracked face frozen at the time of Henry's death. Tears blurred his vision as he closed the watch and slipped it into his pocket. It felt like a message, a reminder of what had been lost, and what had been found. The walk back to his truck was slow, each step heavy with reflection. The cliff no longer felt threatening. It was just a place now, scarred but quiet, where Amos had faced the truth and survived. He climbed into the truck, the engine sputtering to life, and paused to look back one last time. The cliff stood still, bathed in sunlight, its shadows gone. Amos felt a pang of gratitude, not for what had happened but for the chance to move forward. As he drove away, the weight in his chest eased further. He had been given a second chance, and he would not waste it. The pocket watch sat heavy in his pocket, a symbol of the past and the lessons it had taught him. He thought of what lay ahead, a life no longer shadowed by guilt, but shaped by what he had endured. The debt was paid, the balance restored, and for the first time in 50 years, Amos felt free.